Hi guys, today we're looking at Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. As with all the poems, we need to know the context of the poem, we need to know the story of the poem, the language, the structure and the reason the writer wrote it. The reason why the writer wrote it is very, very similar to the context of the poem. So let's take a look at the context first of all. This is Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was alive around about this time. And two things happened at this time, or two things were happening at this time. The first was Britain was becoming industrialised. Now, what that means is large areas of the countryside were being turned into factories. And there were a group of people around this time called the Romantics. Now, the Romantics sound like they're people who would be really interested in romance, love and going on dates and things like that, but that's not quite accurate. When we think of the Romantics, you want to think of people who love nature and therefore really do not like the industrialisation of Great Britain. Here's a picture of a few of the Romantic poets at that particular time. Our man, Percy, there he is, and he was, like the other Romantics, deeply disgusted with the way that Great Britain was being turned into this ugly industrialised land. At the same time, the British Museum discovered this statue. This is a statue of a famous Egyptian ruler called Ramesses II. He's also known as Ozymandias. Ozymandias is Greek version, is the Greek version of his name. Now, he was perhaps the most powerful ruler to be alive at that particular time in Egypt, and by comparison, he could probably be considered one of the most powerful people on earth ever, and therefore, kind of quite rightly, but it's got a bit of a big head here. On a lot of his statues, he would say things like, "I am the most powerful person you will ever come across. All other kings should be afraid of me, and everybody, in fact, should be afraid because of the amount of power I've got." However, ultimately, all that's left of this great, powerful man are these broken statues. Here's an image of the sort of broken statue we talk about in the poem. All we've got left are his legs and his head. This inspired Percy to write a poem about Ozymandias. Here it is. You can see the title here. This one's a bit difficult to read. This one's a little bit easier. This is the one we'll be using in this presentation. And ultimately, why did he write it? This is why I said the context is linked to the reason why the writer wrote it. What he's hoping is that in the same way that Ramesses' great power ultimately died and rotted away to nothing, I wonder if the power of the industrialisation of the country will ultimately die, and we can return back to the lovely countryside that the Romantics dreamed of. So, having covered a bit of the context of the poem, now we need to take a look at the story of the poem. The poem itself is fairly straightforward. The narrator, presumably Percy himself, meets a strange man, a traveller from a very old land, who tells him a story about a statue. This statue that he tells him about looks a bit like this. It's broken up. All that's left are a couple of legs and a smashed up face. And we're also told that the statue has a little plaque on it that says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works and despair." And the poet points out to us that nothing else is around this statue. It's just the broken remnants of the statue and nothing else for as far as you can see. And that, in short, is the story of the poem. It's not particularly complicated, but you do have a lot to talk about when it comes to the language and structure. So let's take a look at the language. As with all the poems, you need to be talking about power and how power is represented in the poems. And in this case, we're looking at how power is represented using language. Well, the first thing is the power that Ozymandias had is a bit mysterious. It's mysterious because we find out about this power not from directly the poet, but via a mysterious traveller from an old land. Antique means old, it's an adjective. And this sense of mystery could suggest that the power that Ozymandias had was in some way mysterious. How could you even comprehend what sort of power this person had? However, we also have another adjective, shattered. The shattered visage of the statue. Visage is face. Shattered is an adjective, and this shows us that not only did the power disappear and die, but it was completely destroyed. But we need to ask ourselves, how big was this power? Well, we get some hints. We have another adjective there, vast. The statue itself was vast. Vast means big. And again, this adjective suggests that the statue itself was so huge, and therefore we could assume that the power behind the maker of the statue, the power behind the person the statue represents, is also extremely big. What else do we know about this power? Well, whoever wielded the power wasn't a particularly nice person. They had a wrinkled lip, and again, another adjective describing the lips of the person. They also had a sneer. Sneer, again, is a sort of nasty smile, suggesting that perhaps there was an element of nastiness to the ruler's power. And also, when he was giving out commands, these were cold commands. Again, the use of an adjective here to suggest that somehow the ruler was cold-hearted. There's also an example of alliteration, cold command. The sound of the k sound for cold command also sounds quite harsh, suggesting that the power was also harsh. And just in case we were in any doubt that the power wasn't completely destroyed, again we're reminded by a few phrases here around the decay. Again, another adjective suggesting destruction of that colossal wreck, another adjective describing the size of the power. The word wreck there, another noun suggesting a complete destruction. Lone and level sands stretch far away. This alliteration, the lone and level, suggests that not only is the statue completely destroyed, it's shattered, it's decayed, it's a wreck, it's also in the middle of nowhere, suggesting that not only is the power destroyed, but the power is also forgotten. Now you may be wondering, why is Percy writing a poem about a great power that is now completely destroyed and no longer relevant to today? Well, I think what Percy's trying to do here is compare the power of Ozymandias to the power of the industrialization of Great Britain. He's thinking of the power behind this. All the money, all the political power, all the great changes that were going on in Great Britain because of industrialization. I believe Percy sees industrialization as a bit like the power that Ozymandias once had. And so Percy is hoping that the power of industrialization will eventually also decay and die like Ozymandias. Now, some people might say, well, look at industrialization, look how much money's involved, look how many factories there are. Industrialization is never going to go away. It's a silly idea. Well, Percy is pointing us to Ozymandias, somebody who was at one point so powerful, other kings would look on him and despair. That verb there, despair, means to effectively just give up. Don't even bother trying to challenge it, just give up. I imagine a lot of people, when they saw industrialization of Great Britain, were just giving up. There's no point in trying to get back to the beautiful countryside that we once loved. But Percy points us towards other great powers and how they ultimately disappear, how they are ultimately destroyed, and perhaps this is his hope that also industrialization will also be destroyed. Well, what about structure? What does the structure tell us again about power? Well, to go back to one of the first ideas, that power can be mysterious, the poet presents the poem in the first person. So we get the idea that perhaps this is the poet himself, Percy. He met then a traveller from an antique land. And this traveller then tells us the story of this particular statue. So the first person is retelling another story from another person. So it's also a third person poem. That could be slightly confusing. But principally, the poem is in the first person. It's being told to us by the poet, and that's important. Because first of all, this traveller from an antique land, well, we don't know who he is. This could be anybody. This could be a liar. It could be somebody completely unreliable. But because we are being told the story from the poet themselves, the story then becomes more reliable. And although the power itself is mysterious, because the poet is confirming for us that the power actually existed, then this whole mysterious story actually becomes reliable and believable. We might not believe the traveller, but we do believe the poet. Furthermore, we also know that things in the first person mean that we get a closer, more intimate view of the emotions of the poet. It makes it more believable, more honest, in fact. Ultimately, by laying out the structure in this way, with the first person being the poet themselves, this mysterious and odd story that might not be believable becomes clearer, it becomes believable, and we also have a greater sense of emotion behind it. We believe the poet when we're told that the Ozymandias had a sneer of cold command, suggesting a vicious power in some way. We believe the poet's feelings about Ozymandias. Another structural point that we need to make is that the poem is a sonnet. As a sonnet is a poem of 14 lines, and each line is made up of 10 syllables. If you count them on your fingers, you'll see that each line counts up to 10. I met a traveller from an antique land, that's 10, who said to vast and trunkless legs of stone, that's also 10. However, unlike ordinary sonnets, which normally follow a very strict pattern of punctuation, where you have to have the punctuation at the end of each line, maybe a little comma at the end of each line like I'm doing here, it doesn't really have that. It has punctuation all over the place. It's got colons here, speech marks there, commas there, all over the place. And so what is meant to be a very rigid and strict set of rules for a poem, Percy is breaking all those rules and breaking up the sonnet. And you could say that this sense of breaking up the rules of the sonnet symbolise the breaking up of the statue itself. So again, a second structural point, why has the poet used so much punctuation? Well, they've used punctuation to essentially to destroy the strict sonnet structure, to mimic, to copy the destruction of the statue itself. Okay, so what have we covered so far? We've managed to cover the context of the poem, we've managed to cover the story of the poem, the language and the structure. And in part we've also covered the reason why the poet wrote it. Ultimately, Percy wrote this to try and get across the idea that industrialization, like all other powers, will ultimately be destroyed. So finally, what could you compare this poem to? A good one is My Last Duchess. In My Last Duchess we have an individual like Ozymandias who believes himself to be all-powerful. Perhaps the Duke in My Last Duchess faces a similar fate to Ozymandias, who knows. You could also compare it to London. This is a poem about some of the nastier aspects of London. London is also an extremely important and powerful city. And again, you could suggest that, like Ozymandias, London one day will be destroyed. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.